Open source economy. So first open source took on computing. I mean, when open source first came around, Microsoft was totally against it, and Microsoft was the behemoth. Now Microsoft, bought GitHub, which is kind of a complete 180, obviously, and Microsoft is, embracing open source, as is IBM. They bought Red Hat, and the whole computing industry is moving more and more to open source. Now that's just a precursor for the economy, because it used to be, for example, that VCs had proprietary deal flow, and they still do. It was kind of a locked system, like Microsoft used to be a locked system, but it's harder and harder for VCs to compete against things like SoftBank. I've already done a podcast about perhaps the only way the VCs in the future will be able to compete against SoftBank and things of that size is open source or crowdsourcing. And I want to talk a little bit about this more generally. So, media has been crowdsourced or open sourced. Everybody has a blog, everybody has a YouTube. Like it used to be that Walter Cronkite was the authority on news. Now you have, millions and millions of people that, are talking about the news, and there's like a million voices, or millions and millions of voices, and billions, to choose from. It's the same thing with open source and computers. So in the future, it's not going to be one bank or even one central bank that controls everything. It's going to be a conglomeration of entities. That is why, like Facebook with their Libra, they have a consortium of companies. I mean, at first, companies are going to try to band together because no one company is strong enough, even no one government is strong enough to control everything. But eventually, there's going to have to be, people power, because even if you control the products, you also need, customers to buy in the system. See, right now the internet, you could argue, is it company powered or is it, consumer powered? What happens is consumers don't necessarily band together. So, technologies don't always 100%, go towards consumers, because like you have Facebook groups and you have a lot of different things where consumers aggregate. But in terms of open source economy, it's being found, like Apple is still a closed system, but after Steve Jobs died, they've got less and less and less influence in terms of innovation. In the future, they call these enabling technologies. The internet is an enabling technology, and it depends how they're used, but the Internet of Things, VR, artificial intelligence can also be enabling technologies. Any new technology can be enabling if it's used well. But what it is that as you have more and more enabling technologies, it's harder and harder and harder to have closed systems because you have more power. Like take the thing about globalization. Like 500 years ago, when everybody lived on a farm or in the Middle Ages, you didn't have reach. You didn't have community on a more than a very local scale. Now, with so much interconnections, and in the future we're going to be colonizing other planets and this and that, it's much more connected in terms of network effects. So when you have network effects like Facebook and any kind of system or marketplace where there's a lot of people that create network effects, then you have more open systems to some degree. I mean, Facebook is still a closed system to a certain degree, but the economies of the future are going to be more and more open source, because eventually, as technology allows greater and greater, like, blogs was kind of an open source system, YouTube is kind of an open source system. These are enabling systems, which makes them, open sourced, because anybody can use them. And people can use them, collectively. So one final distinction. There's a difference between enabling and open source, obviously, because open source, everybody contributes to the same thing, or can potentially, like GitHub, whereas YouTube is kind of an enabling technology where people don't have like mega YouTube channels. What I'm saying, but kind of rambling, not saying it as well, is that a lot of these things that are enabling will become open source and become a source of accountability. So, YouTube will become perhaps like ESPN and CBS, where you have like a lot of contributors banding together to form like mega YouTube channels or mega eBay platforms or mega Fiverr networks. So it's going to move beyond the individual to these enabling technologies to be an open sourced economy.